Welcome back to Dan Recaps. Today, I'm going to explain the movie Nurse 3D, released in the year 2013. For almost 30 years, the FBI had documented more murder cases among health professionals than any other profession, with it also being responsible for the most significant number of serial killers. As the movie begins, we meet Abigail Russell, a nurse who disguises herself as a call girl to infiltrate a club full of deceitful, cheating men. Abigail has a vendetta against such men and intends to kill as many of them as she possibly can. Soon, she is approached by a married man at the club who offers to pay for her drink, but Abigail mocks him for cheating on his wife and lures him to the dance floor. Later that night, Abigail stabs him in the leg and lets him suffer and bleed for a while before throwing him off the rooftop, where he is impaled on an iron gate. Next, we learn that Abigail decided she wanted to be a nurse to help people when she was a young girl. She had grown to become a decorated nurse at the hospital and was assigned to mentor Danny Rogers, a new nurse at the hospital. The new girl reminded Abigail of herself. We then see Abigail inject a man with several syringes during a hookup as part of her vendetta against unfaithful men, ultimately killing him too. At the official induction ceremony for the new nurses, Danny introduces Abigail to her family and her boyfriend Steve, who works as an ambulance driver. Abigail also meets Larry Cook, one of the city's best therapists who happens to be Danny's mother's husband. Abigail already thinks Larry looks like a pervert. We then see Steve and Danny hooking up in one of the hospital rooms, where he asks her to move in with him, but Danny is not yet ready for such a big step. It takes a while for Danny to settle into the hospital, becoming terrified after witnessing a patient in critical condition being rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. It was her first time witnessing such a horrifying scene, and the chief of staff, Dr. Morris, berates her for being a crybaby. Abigail witnesses this and is infuriated by the doctor's actions. She empathizes with Danny when Steve fails to. Abigail offers to buy Danny a drink to make her feel better, during which they discover that Larry is cheating on her mother. Danny is shocked and infuriated, but Abigail is not surprised. She could tell from the start that Larry was a cheat. Despite this, the girls try to have a good time at the club, and Danny soon forgets all about Larry. Danny ends up making out with Abigail and some random dude at the club. The next morning, when Danny wakes up with a terrible hangover, Abigail asks her to call in sick and spend the day with her instead, but Danny refuses. Upset that Danny does not want to spend the day with her, Abigail suspects she feels regret for what they did the night before. Danny asks Abigail to pretend like nothing happened between them, and Abigail vows to get her back. Later that day, as Abigail sets out, her neighbor Jared says he is worried about her and doesn't want her to walk alone. Abigail finds this amusing, but assures him she'll be okay on her own. Abigail shows up at Larry's office pretending to be seeking psychiatric help. She lies that she has an addiction to men and he recommends some treatment, but still, he becomes attracted to her as she expected. Later that day, Dr. Morris harasses Danny again and Abigail becomes angry. As he continues to harass her, Danny becomes increasingly uncomfortable. Unknown to Danny, however, Abigail has developed romantic feelings for her, and when she learns that Steve has sent flowers, she destroys them out of jealousy. Abigail coerces Danny into opening up to her and learns that Steve wants her to move in with him. Abigail warns her against letting men push her into doing things, albeit for her own selfish reasons. She tells Danny Steve is not a good guy and gives her an extra key to her apartment. Danny is surprised, but Abigail tells her it is so she always has a place to crash if she ever feels overwhelmed and needs some space. Danny thanks her and reveals she is worried about her mother and Larry, wanting to protect her mother from him. Abigail wants to protect Danny too, by any means necessary. Later, Abigail intentionally runs into Larry on his way home from work and seduces him. Larry then drives them to an alleyway to hook up, but Abigail injects him with a paralysis drug. She tells him it's a win-win situation since he won't get caught cheating and his wife will be happy too. Unable to move, Larry's car reverses onto the road where it is hit by a trailer, killing him instantly. When Abigail gets home, she finds Danny in her apartment, crying, and tells her that Larry has been murdered. Abigail is happy to finally have Danny all to herself, but all that excitement fades away when Danny tells her she has decided to move in with Steve. She tells Danny that this is not right for her and insists that Steve does not understand her like she does. Abigail becomes aggressive and indirectly confesses to killing Larry for her. Danny freaks out and goes home, leaving the resentful Abigail on her own. At Larry's funeral, Abigail and Danny are questioned by a police detective who suspects they are involved in Larry's death. Danny too is suspicious of Abigail and confronts her, and Abigail admits she was a patient and love interest to Larry. Danny is dumbfounded, but Abigail pretends to be sorry and leaves. Abigail decides to move on and let Danny be, as she was becoming a distraction, while Danny panics after being blackmailed with pictures of her, Abigail, and the stranger from the club. The next day, the new HR director, Rachel Adams, arrives at the hospital and meets with Abigail. She feels that Abigail looks familiar, with a semblance between Abigail and a psychiatric patient she used to know called Sarah Price. As Danny overhears their conversation, Abigail offers to have a drink with Rachel and invites Danny to join them. Danny, however, continues packing her things and lies, saying that she has to go to Steve's. Abigail suspects that Danny has been avoiding her, but she lies that she isn't. Abigail insists that she can see her panicking. Abigail is confused about why Danny is mad at her for killing Larry, whom she hated. This makes Abigail feel that she has failed as a mentor and a friend, and decides to get even with Danny. As Danny arrives at Steve's apartment, she finds someone had mailed him the pictures of that night at the club. Danny tries to distract him while she deletes the photos. He sees one of the pictures, but it is not clear enough, so he assumes that she is just looking at porn. Scared and paranoid, Steve notices that Danny is not being herself. She tells him she just discovered that Abigail was a patient of her late stepfather. Steve, however, suspects something else is bothering her and promises they will talk about it when he gets home from work. That night, Danny receives a video call from a very drunk Rachel, who seems to be having a great time with Abigail, but Danny is worried about her. Abigail then appears and teases a wasted Rachel with a syringe. She is too drunk to notice, but Danny tries to warn her before Abigail suddenly ends the call. Danny reaches for her phone to call the police and report that Abigail is about to kill Rachel. A few minutes later, Danny receives another video call from Rachel, but this time she is unconscious and Abigail taunts Danny with a doll. The next day, Danny goes to the police to file a report, but Abigail had already told the officers that Danny has mental issues. The detective warns Rachel about making false accusations and tells her that Rachel just drank too much and passed out on Abigail's couch. He also tells her to be grateful that Abigail didn't want to press charges. Next, Steve arrives and Danny tells him that Abigail is harassing her, leaving him confused. Abigail had told the detective that Danny was obsessed with her and even broke into her house and made a copy of her key. Danny cannot prove her innocence, and things get worse when the officer brings out the pictures of Danny and Abigail making out. Steve is disappointed and angry, while Danny is shocked, insisting that Abigail is just trying to make her look crazy. She tells the detective she believes Abigail killed her stepfather with a paralytic drug. The detective, however, accuses her of the crime, as she was the one who had signed out that drug before her stepfather's death. Steve is furious. She tries to explain things to him, but the pictures of her and Abigail are more than enough evidence. He tells her not to come back to his house and leaves, while Abigail seems pleased that her plans are working. Later, Abigail watches as Dr. Morris speaks to Danny in private and becomes furious. Sometime after, Abigail suffocates Rachel before she can learn the truth about her past. Meanwhile, Danny visits a psychiatric hospital where Sarah Price was hospitalized. There, she learns that Sarah Price is actually Abigail's real name. When she was young, she caught her father hooking up with another woman. When her mom confronted him about it, he attacked and badly wounded her. A young Abigail picked up a surgical knife and slit her father's throat to save her mother. Her father's mistress testified against her in court, and she was sent to the hospital for treatment by the state. There, Abigail made friends with a nurse called Janet Abigail Russell, whose name she adopted after her mother abandoned her. Abigail lived with Janet for a while, until one day they both disappeared. Danny suspects that Abigail must have killed Janet too. Back at work, Dr. Morris informs Abigail that Danny had filed a report against her and threatens to investigate the case and report her to the board if she doesn't hook up with him. Agreeing to the proposal, Abigail leaves him a trail with her underwear to lure him to a secret room in the hospital where she attacks him. She ties him to the bed and tortures him with a surgical knife, marking his body with the knife and inscribing the word pig on his chest, and eventually slicing his arm off. As Danny heads home, she tries to contact Rachel to warn her about Abigail, but discovers Rachel's phone is in the trunk of her car. She immediately calls Abigail, suspecting she has done something to Rachel, and Abigail threatens her that Steve is next. Danny immediately calls Steve, but is sent to his voicemail. She is worried for his safety and warns him about Abigail in the message. Meanwhile, Abigail has arrived at the hospital and she and Steve are in the same elevator. The detective receives a voicemail from Danny alerting him that she is really Sarah Price. Danny then arrives at the hospital and confronts Abigail, and the two begin to fight. Abigail is wounded in the tussle and tries to flee, killing some of the staff as she escapes from the hospital. Danny tries to stop her, and Abigail furiously attacks her too for refusing to be her friend. Steve, who we then see is still alive, runs to stop them, but Abigail spirals out of control and kills all the patients in the hospital before stabbing Steve and running off. Pretending to be badly wounded, Abigail rushes home but is ambushed by the detective. While she pretends to have been the victim of a mugger, Jared jumps out and hits the detective over the head with a bat. She thanks Jared for his help and orders him to hide the detective's body. Now believing her work is done, Abigail steals the identity of Rachel and becomes the HR director at a new firm. That was all from the video. Subscribe for more content like this and leave a like to help the channel out. Also, leave a comment if you want us to recap your favorite movie. Take care.